The night had fallen over Ravensbrook like a heavy blanket, and the town seemed to sink deeper into an eerie silence. The streets, usually alive with the occasional passerby or the distant sound of a car engine, were empty. No lights flickered in windows, no distant laughter echoed through the alleys. The only movement was the slow sway of tree branches in the wind, creaking under the weight of the coming storm. Amelia Wright stood by her grandmother's front door, staring out into the dimly lit street. The air was cold, the scent of pine and earth carrying on the breeze. She had lived in Ravensbrook for most of her life, but it was only after her grandmother passed away that she had returned to the house she had inherited. It wasn't much to look at. An old Victorian with peeling paint and ivy creeping up its sides. The windows, some cracked, some boarded up, held secrets within their frames. When Amelia had first moved back in, she hadn't expected much. It was supposed to be a simple place to rest her head, a quiet sanctuary away from the busyness of her life. But ever since she stepped over its threshold, something had felt off. The house had a way of making her feel like she was being watched, like the walls were alive with whispers just out of reach, and the floorboards creaked at the slightest movement. There was a heaviness to the air that couldn't be explained. Amelia had learned to ignore it, but tonight, it seemed more palpable than ever. Perhaps it was the isolation, or perhaps the strange pull of something buried deep within the house. Amelia's grandmother had always been a mysterious woman, prone to cryptic comments and odd behavior. There were stories, strange stories, about her grandmother's past, rumors that had floated through town when Amelia was a child, whispers about hidden rooms, about objects that seemed to disappear and reappear, about secrets that had been locked away for generations. But Amelia had never asked. She had never cared enough to pry into a past that seemed so distant. Until now, the day had been spent sorting through old family possessions in the attic, searching for photographs, heirlooms, anything that might remind her of her grandmother. She had hoped to find some comfort in these objects, some trace of the woman who had raised her. But what she found instead was something entirely unexpected. It was an old wooden box. At first, she thought it was just another forgotten trinket, a relic of her grandmother's eccentricities. But as she touched the box, something shifted. The weight of it in her hands, the intricacy of the carvings along its edges. There was something about it that made her heart race. It didn't belong with the rest of the dusty old things in the attic. It stood apart, as though it were waiting for her. The box was sealed with a rusted lock, but there was no key to be found. It was an old lock, the kind that had long since lost its usefulness. Amelia inspected the box carefully, tracing the carved symbols along its surface with her fingers. The symbols were unfamiliar, some sort of intricate design almost like a code. There were no markings to indicate where it had come from, no name or label. Just these strange symbols, embedded into the wood as though they had been burned into it. She had no idea what the symbols meant, but her grandmother's cryptic stories began to come to mind. She had always told Amelia that there were things in this world that could never be explained, things that should remain hidden. Amelia had never understood what she meant by that, and now she found herself standing in front of this box, with no idea what it contained or why it felt so important. As she stood there, contemplating her next move, Amelia heard a noise, a soft creak, as if something had shifted behind her. She turned quickly, but the attic was as empty as it had been moments ago. Still, the sound lingered in her mind. A chill ran up her spine, and for a fleeting moment, she wondered if her grandmother's stories about the house were more than just tales. But she shook off the feeling. There was no point in succumbing to superstition. The box was the only thing that mattered now. After hours of searching, Amelia was no closer to finding the key to the box. The attic was filled with old furniture, dusty portraits, and mementos from a time long past, but nothing that could unlock the mystery in her hands. Frustrated, she decided to sleep on it. She locked the attic door behind her and made her way down the stairs, the box still heavy in her hands. Dinner was solitary as usual. Amelia had never been much for company, and the town of Ravensbrook was quiet, almost too quiet. The people who remained in town were either the elderly or those who had nowhere else to go. She ate her meal slowly, chewing each bite as though the act of eating might distract her from the gnawing curiosity that tugged at her mind. Later that night, after cleaning up, she found herself staring at the box once more. It sat on the kitchen table, still unopened, still locked. She reached for it, her fingers brushing the carved symbols once again. What was it that her grandmother had hidden away? Amelia couldn't rest until she found out. She grabbed the box and returned to the attic. The dim light from the single bulb overhead cast long shadows across the room, adding to the sense of unease that settled in her chest. She set the box down and began searching the house once more, checking drawers, lifting old carpets, searching for anything that might lead her to the key. Hours passed. The clock ticked, the wind howled outside, and still, Amelia found nothing. Her grandmother's study, a small room off the main hallway, was the last place she thought to look. The study had been untouched since her grandmother's passing. The shelves were filled with books, some old, some new, but nothing out of the ordinary. Nothing that might contain a hidden key. She sat in the chair, exhausted and frustrated, her fingers tracing the edges of the box again. The silence in the house was oppressive, as though the walls themselves were closing in. But then her fingers brushed against something metal. She looked down, her heart skipping a beat. It was a key, tucked underneath the worn upholstery of the chair. Amelia took the key in her hands, her breath catching in her throat. It was old, worn, but it fit perfectly with the lock on the box. She knew, without a doubt, that this was the key she had been searching for. With trembling hands, she walked back to the attic, holding the key before her like it was the key to a locked door in her mind. She placed the key into the rusted lock, and with a soft click, the box opened. Inside was a piece of paper, yellowed with age, and a small, folded map. The map depicted Ravensbrook, but it was different from any map Amelia had ever seen. It showed streets that no longer existed, buildings that had long since been torn down. And in the center of the map, marked with an ominous X, was a location she recognized, the old church. Amelia's pulse quickened. The map, her grandmother's cryptic words, the symbols on the box, all pointed to one place, the church. The mystery had just begun. The following morning, Amelia awoke with a sense of urgency gnawing at her. The map had consumed her thoughts all night, its delicate lines and the strange X marking the old church. There had to be something there, something her grandmother had hidden, something that could explain the cryptic box and the strange symbols that seemed to be tied to everything in her life. The more Amelia thought about it, the more she realized that her grandmother had known more than she had let on. She'd been trying to guide her even in death. Ravensbrook was a quiet town, set against the backdrop of thick woods and rolling hills. The old church, nestled at the end of a cobblestone lane, was one of the few landmarks that had stood the test of time. The building itself was ancient, its stone walls weathered by centuries of wind and rain. Its steeple reached high into the sky, but the church itself had long since fallen out of use. The town had built a new, modern church several years ago, but the old one remained, a relic of another time. Amelia had never given the church much thought. It had always seemed out of place, a forgotten structure looming over the town. But now it felt different. The map, the symbols, the box, it was all leading her there. There was no doubt in her mind that the answers lay within its walls. She dressed quickly, her mind racing as she left the house. The air was crisp and cool, the kind of chill that hinted at an impending storm. Amelia's footsteps echoed in the empty streets as she made her way toward the church. The town was still asleep, the usual hum of activity absent in the early morning hours. The church loomed ahead, its shadow stretching long over the cobblestones. It looked even older up close, as though it had been forgotten by time itself. The door creaked as she pushed it open, the hinges protesting the disturbance. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the smell of old wood. The stained glass windows, now cracked and faded, let in only faint slivers of light. The pews, long abandoned, stood like silent sentinels in the dimness. It felt like stepping into a different era, a place suspended between time and memory. Amelia's heart beat faster as she walked down the aisle, her footsteps muffled on the thick carpet. She looked around, her eyes scanning the room for any sign of the X from the map. She approached the altar, her gaze lingering on the ornate carvings that decorated the stone. It was beautiful in its way, but there was something unsettling about it, something that made her skin prickle with unease. Then her eyes fell on the floor. The stones beneath her feet were uneven, the gaps between them wider than they should have been. She bent down, running her fingers along the edges of the tiles. There was something off about the way they were laid. She pressed her fingers against one of the stones, and to her surprise, it shifted slightly under her touch. A hidden compartment. Amelia's breath caught in her throat as she knelt down and carefully pried the stone up. Beneath it, she found a small iron handle. Her hands trembled as she pulled, and the trapdoor creaked open, revealing a narrow staircase that descended into darkness. A rush of cold air surged up from the depths below, and Amelia hesitated. Her mind screamed at her to turn back, but her curiosity was stronger. She had come this far. She had to know what lay beneath. She took a deep breath and descended into the shadows. The staircase was steep, the air growing colder with each step. The stone walls were damp and slick with moisture, and the faint sound of dripping water echoed in the distance. At the bottom of the stairs, Amelia found herself in a small underground chamber. The room was dimly lit by flickering candles placed haphazardly along the walls. Strange symbols, similar to those on the box, were carved into the stone, their meanings still elusive. As she stepped further into the room, her eyes were drawn to a large wooden chest in the corner. It looked old, much older than anything in the church. The wood was dark and weathered, and the metal bindings were corroded with age. The chest was covered in the same symbols she had seen earlier, and the lock on the front was strange, unlike any lock she had ever seen before. Amelia approached it cautiously, her pulse quickening. There was no mistaking it now. This was the final piece of the puzzle. Her grandmother had hidden something here, something important. She had known about the Raven Society, about the secret they had kept for generations. But what was inside the chest? Amelia knelt down, inspecting the lock. It was intricate, with several small gears and moving parts. She knew she wouldn't be able to open it without the right tool, but she had no idea where to find the key. She looked around the chamber, searching for anything that might give her a clue. Then she saw it, another symbol, this one etched into the stone wall behind the chest. It was different from the others, more complex. The symbol seemed to glow faintly, as though it were alive, pulsating with a strange energy. Amelia's heart skipped a beat as she realized what it was. It was the same symbol that had been carved into the box she had found in the attic. Her grandmother had left her a trail, pieces of a puzzle that only she could solve. The symbol, the box, the map, the church, all of it was leading her to this moment. But what did it all mean? What was she supposed to do now? As if in answer, the ground beneath her feet shifted, and the walls seemed to close in. A low, humming sound filled the air, vibrating through the stone. Amelia stood up, her hands shaking, and backed away from the chest. The humming grew louder, and the air seemed to thicken, pressing down on her. The room felt smaller, more oppressive. Suddenly, there was a sharp noise, like the sound of metal scraping against stone. Amelia spun around, her eyes wide with fear. The chest had begun to open. Inside, there was a small, leather-bound book. It looked ancient, its pages yellowed with age. Amelia reached out hesitantly, her fingers brushing the cover. As soon as she touched it, the humming stopped. The air grew still again, but the sense of unease lingered. She picked up the book and opened it. The pages were filled with strange writing, a language she didn't recognize. At the center of the book, there was an intricate diagram, an image of a large, circular object surrounded by symbols she had seen before. The hollow. The word was written beneath the diagram in the same strange script. Amelia's blood ran cold as she realized what she had found. The Raven Society hadn't just been guarding a treasure. They had been guarding something far more dangerous, something that could destroy everything. The hollow wasn't just a place. It was a force, a power that could change the very fabric of reality itself. Her grandmother had known, and now Amelia knew too. But what was she supposed to do with this knowledge? How could she stop whatever was coming? As Amelia turned to leave, the chest suddenly slammed shut, the sound echoing through the chamber. The humming had returned, louder than before, and the ground seemed to shake beneath her feet. Amelia knew then, with a certainty she couldn't ignore, that this was only the beginning. The hollow was calling, and whatever had been set into motion, whatever her grandmother had tried to warn her about, was coming for her. Amelia stood frozen in the underground chamber, the leather-bound book clutched tightly in her hands. The hum in the air was deafening now, the sound vibrating through her chest. The chest that had once contained the book now sat closed, its rusted lock intact, as if it had never been opened. But Amelia's focus was entirely on the book before her. The word hollow echoed in her mind, its significance growing with every passing second. What had her grandmother known? What had she hidden? And why had the Raven Society guarded it for so long? The room felt smaller now, oppressive. The air was thick with the weight of centuries of secrets, of a truth buried deep beneath the surface of Ravensbrook. Amelia could almost hear the whispering of the town itself, the trees swaying in the wind, the creaking of old houses, the faint murmur of voices long gone. It was as if the town had been waiting for her to uncover this, as if everything had been set into motion the moment she entered her grandmother's house. She took a deep breath and glanced around, the symbols carved into the stone walls seeming to pulse with an eerie glow. Her mind was racing, trying to make sense of it all. But there was no time to linger. She needed answers. And to find those answers, she would have to confront the one person who knew more than anyone, the only one who might understand the true nature of the hollow. Her father. Amelia had never been particularly close to her father. He had disappeared when she was just a child, leaving her and her mother to fend for themselves. No explanation, no warning. One day he was simply gone. Over the years, there had been rumors, whispers in the town that he had joined some sort of cult, that he had been involved in things best left untouched. But Amelia had never believed those rumors. She had always thought her father's disappearance was just a part of the town's strange, sometimes twisted history. Now she wasn't so sure. The hollow, the Raven Society, her grandmother's cryptic warnings, it all pointed to him. Amelia hurried out of the church, her mind spinning. She needed to find her father, and she needed to do it now. There were too many pieces of the puzzle that didn't fit, too many unanswered questions. The book in her hands felt heavy, as though it were calling to her, urging her forward. Her father had been living on the outskirts of Ravensbrook, in a small house just beyond the forest. It wasn't much, just a weathered cottage surrounded by tall trees, the kind of place where someone could disappear and remain hidden from the world. Amelia had never gone there before, never felt the need. But now, she was drawn to it, as if the place itself held the key to everything. The drive to his house was a blur, her eyes fixed on the road as the trees on either side seemed to close in. The sky had grown darker, the storm clouds rolling in from the horizon. It felt as though the storm were a reflection of the turmoil inside her, a prelude to the chaos that was about to unfold. When she arrived at her father's house, the first thing she noticed was the silence. There was no sign of life, no movement behind the windows. The small garden in front of the house was overgrown, the plants wild and untamed. It was as though time had stopped here, as though the house had been abandoned for years. But Amelia knew her father was still alive. He had to be. She stepped out of the car, the gravel crunching beneath her boots. Her breath was shallow, her heart pounding in her chest. She walked toward the front door, her hand trembling as she reached for the doorknob. Before she could turn it, the door swung open on its own, revealing a dark, empty hallway beyond. A chill ran down her spine. Her father's voice echoed from somewhere deeper in the house, though she could not tell from where. It was low, almost like a whisper, but it was unmistakably his. It seemed to come from the basement. Amelia hesitated. She had heard the stories about the basement, the hidden rooms, the strange things that her father had kept down there. The townspeople spoke in hushed tones about it, but Amelia had always thought it was just superstition. Now, standing on the threshold of her father's home, those rumors seemed more like warnings. But she couldn't back down now. She had come this far. With a deep breath, she descended the stairs to the basement, each step creaking under her weight. The air grew colder as she moved deeper into the house, the smell of mildew and old wood thickening with every breath. The basement door stood at the end of the hall, its wooden frame warped with age. The door, like the rest of the house, was covered in the same strange symbols Amelia had seen in the church, in her grandmother's attic, and on the box. She reached for the handle, her fingers cold and stiff. The door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit room filled with strange artifacts. Books stacked in piles, old candles, faded maps. It looked like a place of worship, though not of any religion Amelia recognized. And then she saw him. Her father was sitting at a wooden table in the center of the room, his back hunched over a large book. His hair was long, unkempt, and his clothes were ragged, as though he hadn't bothered to care for himself in years. But despite the disheveled appearance, his eyes were sharp, his gaze focused on the pages in front of him. When he looked up and saw Amelia standing in the doorway, his expression didn't change. There was no surprise, no recognition. It was as though he had been waiting for her. "Amelia," he said quietly. His voice was rough, worn from years of disuse, but it held an unmistakable warmth. "I knew you'd come." "Father," she whispered, taking a step into the room. "What is all of this? What's happening? What is the hollow?" Her father didn't answer immediately. He closed the book in front of him and then, slowly, he stood up. The room seemed to darken as he did, the shadows creeping along the walls. "The hollow is not just a place," he said, his voice distant, as if recalling something from a long-forgotten dream. "It is an entity, an ancient force that has existed for centuries. It is what the Raven Society has been guarding all this time. The power within it is both a blessing and a curse. And now it is awakening." Amelia's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean, awakening? What is it going to do?" Her father's eyes darkened. "It will destroy everything. The hollow is not something you can control. No one can. But your grandmother, she knew. She tried to warn me, and now it's too late. The seals are broken. The book you found, the one you have in your hands, is the final key." Amelia's pulse raced as she held up the book, its pages now feeling heavier than ever. "What do I do? How do I stop it?" Her father's face softened, a hint of sadness creeping into his eyes. "There's only one way to stop the hollow, but it comes at a great cost. You must return to the church. You must enter the hollow before it fully awakens. It is the only way to close it." Amelia felt a surge of dread. "But how do I do that? What if I fail?" Her father's expression was grim. "If you fail, everything will be lost. But you can't run from it, Amelia. You're the only one who can stop it now." As he spoke, the storm outside grew louder, the wind howling against the windows. The ground beneath the house seemed to tremble, as though the hollow itself were reaching up to claim them. Amelia had no choice. She had come too far to turn back now. With a final glance at her father, she turned and ran out of the basement, the book clutched tightly in her hands. The hollow was calling to her. The time had come.